Chapter 14 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Capricia Page. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 14 Queen Elizabeth of England. We will now tell the story of a young girl who became the most famous queen that the world has ever known, and has laid the real foundations for the modern greatness of the English nation. The name of this girl was Elizabeth, and the time in which she lived has since been called the Elizabethan era. For England at that time was rich in the bravest soldiers, the most daring sailors, and the greatest men of genius, and Elizabeth knew well how to surround herself with these men and use their great talents to benefit her country. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his wife, Anne Boleyn. Her childhood was far from being a happy one, for Henry was a cruel tyrant and showed harshness to the princess in many ways. When Elizabeth was only 3 years old, her mother was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and then beheaded at King Henry's order, and her own right to succeed him on the throne of England was taken away from her. Then she was sent into the country to be brought up by servants and attendants, and seldom was allowed at the royal court. King Henry married a lady named Catherine Parr, and Elizabeth became a favorite with her stepmother. For the first time in her life, she received a little affection and kindness. Catherine saw that she had the attention she needed, and brought her back to court. But although she was still only a child, something she said or did once more awakened her father's anger, and Elizabeth was sent away in disgrace, and not permitted to return until after his death. A son had been born to Henry VIII by another wife named Jane Seymour, and this boy, who was christened Edward, succeeded his father on the throne of England. Elizabeth, who was noted for her demure bearing, was then 13 years old, and became a great favorite with her brother, the boy king, who called her sweet sister Temperance, and gave many signs of his regard for her. But Edward VI did not live very long. He had a serious disease that wasted him away, and Elizabeth's half-sister named Mary became queen. Now Mary was an ardent Catholic, and desired that all England should come under the power of the Catholic Church. To bring this about, she persecuted the Protestants in her kingdom mercilessly, until anybody who professed to the Protestant faith was in danger of being burned at the stake. Mary, moreover, had married the dismal Spanish king, Philip II, who tried to have her treat her subjects as he had done with the people of the Low Countries, until through the efforts of William the Silent they won their freedom. And Mary was surrounded with advisers who were even more fanatical and cruel than the queen herself. One of Mary's first acts when she became queen was to send for her sister Elizabeth and command her to become a Catholic. Elizabeth had been brought up as a Protestant and believed in the Protestant religion, but to save her life she decided to pretend to obey her sister's order and to adopt the outward forms of the Catholic faith. And then more trouble befell Elizabeth, for due to her sister's harsh rule, which had won her the name of Bloody Mary, a revolt broke out among a number of English people to place Elizabeth upon the throne. For the Protestants had not been deceived by Elizabeth's pretended conversion. They knew that she was a Protestant at heart, and that if she were only queen, the cruel persecutions would straightway be ended. And a young man named Wyatt began a rebellion in Elizabeth's name that was only put down after severe rioting. Wyatt was captured and stated that the Princess Elizabeth had known of the plot, and Elizabeth was summoned to Mary to explain the accusations against her, and prove, if possible, that she had no share in the undertaking. Elizabeth was very much frightened, and in fact she had every reason to be. She dressed herself in all white, as a symbol of her innocence, and went through the streets of London on her way to the Queen. And the people gazed at her sadly, and shook their heads, for they were afraid that she was going to her death. Mary, who was influenced by her advisers, refused to see her sister, and would not listen to her assurances of innocence. And finally an armed guard came before Elizabeth and told her that she must go at once to the Tower of London, where she was to be held a prisoner. The Tower of London, which is standing today, is a gloomy fortress that was built in the time of William the Conqueror, and since that time had been the scene of many tragedies and executions, for the most dangerous political prisoners were confined there. Elizabeth's own mother had been put to death within its solid walls, and Elizabeth had every reason to fear that a similar fate was intended for her by her sister Mary. Guarded by soldiers, the princess was taken by a boat down the Thames River, but instead of stopping at the usual entrance to the Tower, the boat drew towards a portal known as Traitor's Gate, where many of the worst prisoners entered, only to meet the axe of the executioner. "I am no traitor," Elizabeth cried out angrily when she saw where she was. "I will not pass in by way of the Gate of Traitors." And when she was sternly told that she must obey, she added, "Here lands as true an English subject as ever set foot on these stairs." That she was near death she knew very well, and whenever she heard an unusual bustle or stir in the prison courtyard, she tried anxiously to see what was going on there, for she feared that they might be building a scaffold for her execution. And her fears were only too well founded, for the Queen's advisers hated Elizabeth, and did not think that Catholic rule in England was safe as long as the princess was alive. This, rather than the charge of treason that had been trumped up against her, was the real reason for her imprisonment. On one occasion, we are told, Mary fell ill, and her counsellors took the opportunity to have Elizabeth put to death. A warrant of execution was prepared, and an order was sent to the keeper of the Tower to carry out the punishment at once. "Where is the Queen's signature?" demanded that official. "The Queen is too ill to sign it, but it is sent in her name," was the reply. "Then I will wait until she is well enough to send her order in person," said the keeper. And Elizabeth's life was saved, for Mary was furious when she learned how her counsellors had tried to take the law into their own hands, and in spite of their remonstrances, Elizabeth was soon afterwards taken from the Tower and set at liberty. Queen Mary died in 1558, when Elizabeth was 25 years old, and as it was known that Elizabeth would now come to the throne, there was great rejoicing throughout England. Bonfires blazed and bells were rung, and in joy at the accession of Elizabeth, the people forgot to mourn for the dead queen, whose gloomy reign and religious cruelties had caused her to be feared and hated everywhere. From the first day of her reign, Queen Elizabeth showed that she was a Protestant at heart, and she put an immediate end to religious persecution. But Elizabeth was too shrewd to take any steps that would cause the Catholics to hate her. She wanted the love and respect of her entire people, and always shaped her course in such a way that she could gain the goodwill of the greatest number of her subjects. Elizabeth hated war, and carried on her rule in such a way that she could avoid it as far as possible. She encouraged trade and commerce and learning and the sciences, and had in her possession long lists of her subjects who had shown great ability, either as soldiers or sailors, or in those fields of art and scholarship, and she rewarded such men richly. The ambition of all Englishmen was to make themselves worthy of being placed on one of those lists. As a result of this policy, which was almost unparalleled in the history of the world, England began steadily to forge ahead in the occupations of peace, and a number of great and illustrious men sprang into fame. The poet Shakespeare commenced to write his immortal plays, and Spenser and Bacon both made deathless contributions to English literature. The great explorers Martin Frobisher and Sir Francis Drake brought back from their voyages priceless knowledge of geography and many treasures and discoveries to enrich England. The English statesmen Cecil and Walsingham followed a shrewd and far-sighted policy, allowing England to grow strong through the wars of other nations without engaging in them herself, and put a stop to the former extravagant proceedings in which the public money had been wasted. But in spite of her desire to keep out of war, many troubles beset Elizabeth. In Scotland there was a young queen called Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, who claimed the throne of England in addition to her own. Mary had always been the centre of trouble and turmoil, and had frequently been embroiled with England. And being a Catholic, there were many among Elizabeth's subjects who would have been rejoiced to see her on the throne in place of Elizabeth. On one occasion, however, when Mary had been engaged in civil war in Scotland, she was compelled to fly across the Scottish border and throw herself on the protection of the English Queen. Elizabeth did not dare leave Mary at liberty in England, for she feared the plots that might arise as a result. So Mary was promptly put in prison and kept there for 18 years, with considerable pomp and state as befitted her high birth, but a captive for all that, and one that was closely watched. Holding Mary a prisoner, however, was a very foolish thing for Elizabeth to do, for at once the Scottish Queen became a subject of conspiracies among the English Catholics. Many of these were detected, and Elizabeth's statesmen urged the Queen to sign Mary's death warrant, and put an end once and for all to the cause of internal trouble in England that would continue as long as Mary lived. But Elizabeth was most unwilling to take the life of her own cousin, who had come to England of her own accord for safety, and she continued to keep Mary under lock and key. At last, however, a plot was discovered in which Mary was not only to be rescued, but placed on the throne of England, and the plot went so far as to plan the murder of Queen Elizabeth. And there was evidence that Mary had actually shared in this conspiracy, and to some extent had directed it from her prison. The Scottish Queen was taken to Fotheringay Castle, where she was tried for high treason and sentenced to death. And Elizabeth very reluctantly signed the warrant. So Mary was beheaded, going to her death with the dignity and firmness that have added to her fame throughout the centuries. These internal troubles were not only ones that Elizabeth had to contend with. Philip of Spain had tried to marry her after the death of her sister, because he had wanted to continue to influence English politics. Elizabeth had refused him, and the King of Spain had long been her enemy, and was seeking to bring England back under the Catholic rule. Although outwardly professing friendship, Philip was preparing for war with England, and his ships captured English vessels on the high seas, and their crews were sent to torture or death, because they were Protestants. England did not sit meekly by and watch these depredations on her seamen. English sailors were as good as any, and often captured Spanish ships in their turn, and Spanish gold frequently found its way to the English treasury, instead of into the coffers of Philip. England was poor, and had not then come to her full power as a great nation, and Elizabeth did not feel able openly to go to war with Spain, much as she desired to do so. But while she would not give orders for her sailors to attack Spanish ships, she was not a little pleased to have her share of the Spanish gold. Chief among her sailors who brought home treasure in this way were Sir John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake. The last of these was a great friend of Elizabeth's, on account of his bold deeds and his great discoveries, and much more is told of him in another chapter of this book. For he not only took many rich ships from Spain, but sailed around the world, bringing back with him great knowledge and gold and gems of priceless value. And although Elizabeth had warned Drake to see that he did no harm to her good friend Philip of Spain, she rewarded him richly for his deeds. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, had greatly angered Philip, and the deeds of the English buccaneers filled him with rage. He labored for years collecting a great fleet to invade England, and crowded the decks of his vessels with soldiers. This fleet was called the Invincible Armada, and set sail for England in 1588. Elizabeth rallied her countrymen, and with the utmost coolness and bravery made her preparations for defense. Every Englishman who could wield a sword was called to defend his country. Boys of 18 were enlisted, and men of 60 once more became men-at-arms. For Elizabeth knew that if Philip ever gained a foothold in England, the same terrible scenes would be enacted there that had taken place in the Low Countries. But the Spanish army never landed in England. When its sails appeared, and it seemed as though it must overwhelm the small English fleet that was opposed to it, Queen Elizabeth on horseback rode among her soldiers, encouraging and cheering them, and urging them to fight to their last drop of blood in defense of their country. But the English fleet, under Sir Francis Drake, put the Spanish ships to flight and sunk a great number of them, and a gale of wind did the rest, wrecking the unwieldy Spanish boats and drowning thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors. Elizabeth's courage and the loyalty with which she had been served by her brave subjects had saved England, and never since that time, with the exception of a raid by the American sailor Paul Jones, have British shores been reached by a foreign foeman. The English nation was changing in Elizabeth's reign, more than in any former period, and many blessings were being given to the Queen's subjects that they had never hitherto known. Her reign saw the last vestige of bondage and servitude die out, and men were now allowed to practice the Protestant religion without the constant fear of death. They became, moreover, used to a better manner of living, and enjoyed luxuries that their fathers had never known. Of course, from our standards their lives would have seemed poor and rough, but none the less they were a distinct advance over all that had gone before. The brilliant court kept by Elizabeth was surpassed by no other in all Europe, and the magnificence of her dress had never been equalled. In this respect the Queen resembled her father, Henry VIII, who always had loved display. She had 1,000 gowns of silk and rich materials, all richly decorated with gold and precious stones. Her hair was bright with gold and gems, and in her palace gold and rare gems were seen on every side. The Queen was very fond of travelling in state through England, and on her way she would arrange to visit different noblemen in their castles, where they had to provide for her entertainment. These trips were called her progresses, and the noblemen selected to entertain her considered themselves unlucky enough, for they had to go to enormous expense to satisfy her whims, and were never sure of her gratitude, while on the other hand, they were always certain to hear from her if anything displeased her. The most costly banquets, the richest wines, the most brilliant pageants, the most extravagant novelties and flatteries were expected, if not demanded, by the Queen in the course of these entertainments. Among her courtiers, Queen Elizabeth had many favourites, and perhaps the worthiest of them was Sir Walter Raleigh. This gentleman was famous for his courtly speech and gentle manners, things that delighted the Queen, as well as for the richness of his apparel. On one occasion, in the course of a trip, the Queen had to cross a muddy place in the road and hesitated before soiling her delicate slippers. But Sir Walter Raleigh slipped off the rich blue velvet cloak that he wore and cast it in the mud in front of the Queen for her to walk upon. He knew well that she would return the value of the cloak 20 times over in the benefits she would confer on him, and this proved to be the case. Sir Walter Raleigh was an explorer as well as a courtier, and had been interested in the establishing of a colony in the New World, calling the lands there Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen, a name that has lasted to the present day, and from Virginia the potato and tobacco were first brought to England, and Sir Walter Raleigh used to smoke tobacco in a silver pipe, sometimes in the Queen's presence. The Queen had other favourites besides Sir Walter Raleigh, and chief of these was the Earl of Leicester. It was believed for a time that she would marry him, but this did not come to pass. Another of her favourites was the Earl of Essex, a self-willed and spoiled young man, who frequently had difficulties with the Queen. On one occasion he rudely turned his back on her, and Elizabeth retorted by boxing his ears. Almost always after these affairs Essex left or was sent from court, but ultimately was pardoned and returned. The Earl of Essex was put in command of troops in Ireland, and word of his mismanagement was soon brought to Elizabeth. When he was recalled and punished, he believed that a great wrong had been put upon him and engaged in a conspiracy against the Queen. For this he was imprisoned in the Tower and beheaded. Elizabeth reigned over England until she was 70 years old. As she grew older, she was troubled with ill health, but her indomitable spirit never failed. She continued to ride until she had to be lifted to her horse, and she ruled with a firm hand long after her health had failed, and she had grown ill and feeble. But the end of her life was not happy. The throngs of courtiers who had offered her the flattery and homage that were so dear to her, found some excuse or other to go elsewhere, and to bow themselves before the feet of James of Scotland, the son of the unfortunate Mary Queen of Scots. For James was now the recognized heir of the English throne. One after one, Elizabeth's followers deserted her, and at times she was found alone and in tears by the few faithful attendants that remained. She could, of course, command attendance, but not the love that she had formerly known, for there was now little to be gained from serving her, and she had, moreover, been made unpopular by the execution of the Earl of Essex, who was loved by the common people. Elizabeth died in her sleep in 1603, passing away without pain, and we are told that when her coffin was borne to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried, that all the former love of her subjects returned, and she was mourned as no sovereign has been mourned before or since her time. And this was only fitting, for in spite of her many faults, her like has seldom been seen upon a throne or in the course of history. End of chapter 14. Recording by Capricia Page.